This is Law Bytes, a podcast with Michael Geist.
Today, I'm announcing the next steps for the Online News Act. We have found a path forward to answer Google's questions about the process and the act. Google wanted certainty about the amount of compensation it would have to pay to Canadian news outlets, and I can say today that Google will be compensating our news organization with $100 million annually, and it will be indexed to inflation.
That was Heritage Minister Pascal St-Onge last week, announcing that the government had reached agreement with Google on a deal that will ensure news links are not blocked on the search engine, and that the company pays $100 million to support the news sector in Canada. The harm from Facebook and Instagram blocking news links was taking a significant toll, with lost revenues, lost traffic, and lost deals, meaning that something had to be salvaged from Bill C-18. It turns out that the way to salvage the Online News Act was essentially to start over by tossing aside most of the core elements of the law in favor of a single payment by Google negotiated by the government on behalf of the news sector. The reaction to the agreement from the news sector has been mixed at best, with relative silence from many supporters and outright opposition from the likes of Torstar. So what to make of the deal and what comes next? Jeff Elgie is the CEO of Village Media, one of the largest independent digital-only news outlets in Canada. He joins me on the podcast to walk through his participation in the legislative process, reaction to the agreement, and thoughts for the future. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
It's great to have you back. You know, the last time you were on was back in June of 2022, so almost a year and a half ago, and you came on with Farhan Mohammed. It was pretty early days. Obviously, it took another year for what was that, Bill C-18 to become law. I think it was pretty predictable even then what some of the things that might emerge, but it certainly did become controversial. Meta, of course, indicating that it would block news links, Google suggesting that it would do the same based on how the law was structured. I'd like to walk through a little bit the last 6 months for Village Media, as well as, of course, the deal that just occurred between the government and Google. But before we do that, for those that aren't familiar, can you once again just quickly introduce Village Media and perhaps talk a little bit about your perspective on the bill, especially in the early days as it was unfolding?
So Village Media, we are now almost exactly 10 years old. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary in November. We are a local focused digital-only publisher. We now operate 21 community sites in Ontario, another 4 sites, business publication, Queen's Park publication, lifestyle publication, and an aggregator, so 25 sites in Canada. We also license technology to what by next week will be over another 120 sites across Canada to companies like Glacier Media, Black Press Media, and others. So yeah, we're profitable, we're growing, and we're loving this business. So my view on the bill, that's a big question. We have been kind of against the approach on this bill from the very beginning. The early days of this, as you know, was kind of this narrative that these big platforms come in and steal our content and they don't give us anything in return. And we were always kind of saying, well, hey, wait a minute, first of all, they don't steal content from us. We want our content on those platforms because it gives us massive reach to audience. And they do give us a lot back because they give us traffic back. And that traffic turns into ad sales, or in the case of a subscription publisher, subscription sales. So we were always really against the thrust of the bill because we thought it was unfair. It was unfair to the platforms. Now, do we think the platforms could or should support journalism in Canada? Sure. And I think there was much better ways to go about getting to the outcome we're now at, actually. So we've been very consistent with our opinion on that since the very beginning of this.
Yeah, no, and that's true, and in some ways that's reflective, I think, of quite a lot of the independent digital first players that yes. Looked at some of those platforms more more along the lines of a partner as opposed to a thief in the way that some try to characterize it.
Yes.
I am curious to hear about your thoughts of the legislative process. Unless I missed something, my recollection is you didn't get an invitation to the hearings that took place before the House Heritage Committee. Not that many did, quite frankly. They didn't hold that many, but you did before the Senate, and that was actually quite memorable. I remember in particular response or question that you got from Senator Harder about weren't you happy in
Right.
some ways when you saw these papers being shut down, which I thought was just astonishing. What did you make of the process, and particularly the concerns that were being raised amongst many of those digital first or digital only news publications, and whether they were being heard or included in that process?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the process was not good. It took us a lot of effort, even to get in front of the Senate. We tried to get in front of the House, and it felt to me all the way through, even at the Senate, to be honest, who I thought would be a lot more receptive. It felt to me all the way through that there was already an agenda, that the narrative had been established, that they were really not wanting to hear an alternative. They were looking for support for what the government had in mind, but not looking for people to come in and say, "Hey, look, there's another path, and by the way, there are models that can work in this business, and here's what we think." So, we weren't overly happy with having a voice during that time period, for sure.
You can understand the frustration. Now, you had, and part of the reason, of course, that I assume you'd want to appear is the chance to express both some of your concerns about the bill and ensure that they better understood some of the alternative business models that were out there. As the bill came to a close last June, did you anticipate the response that we ultimately did see from Google and Meta?
Well, we for sure did. I mean, so in May, actually, our company announced quite publicly that until the outcome of this was known, we fully suspended any kind of expansion. So we didn't want to hire more journalists. We didn't want to launch new community publications, even though we had some on our roadmap, because our fear was, well, in fact, pretty much exactly what happened, at least in the case of Meta, is that they could potentially pull from the business. So, fortunately, we did see that coming. I mean, we also have made effort, to be quite truthful, since this bill was even conceived, to kind of wean ourselves off of Facebook as much as possible, focus on other channels, because we were especially concerned about them pulling. They have less reason to be in the business. They certainly historically haven't been as close to the news, haven't cared as much as Google has, for example. So we always felt they were the most likely. And then obviously we're very worried that Google could potentially pull as well.
Yeah. So that's interesting that you started preparing even before the bill itself was passed and became law. So that's the response. What was the effect, would you say? What has been the effect over the last number of months of the Meta block news links?
Yeah, so we've been very public about those numbers too, in the sense that, pre the Meta block, Facebook in particular, so Meta, obviously Facebook and Instagram, but Facebook in particular was responsible for about 17% of our traffic on our own properties. And Google was kind of 33, 34, 35%. So combined, the two are 50%. And so, as soon as Meta blocked, you immediately felt the traffic impact. I think it's fair to say that some of the audience has rerouted, so they know we're not there anymore and they'll go out seeking news. But without question, our traffic is impacted by that. It's hard to say because traffic is seasonal and cyclical. I mean, but we can see visibly the traffic is down, despite even our efforts to try to make up for it in other ways, like we've introduced new commenting tools, recirculation widgets, etc. So the way I look at it now is, as much as we're holding our own, we'd be much further ahead if Meta was still in the business. The bigger concern that I have, and as we've always said, is that when we launch new markets, or even as a community is in that kind of launch phase, which is usually the first couple of years before we get a large enough audience to make it a sustainable publication, Facebook was our number one tactic. So number one tactic for developing a Facebook following, exposing people passively to those organic posts, getting them familiar with our news, with our brand, with our site, and then that would lead them on to other behaviors. They would then bookmark us, etc., or they would, install us on their home screen. And the other thing we used them for was to drive newsletter subscriptions. I've always in the past talked about kind of we want to take Facebook's audience and abuse Facebook and make them our own. And that's one of the ways we would do it. We would actively use it for lead gen programs. And so those were our best tactics. And we do everything. We have events, we sponsor charities, we take out billboards, we, meet the mayor, meet the downtown association, the chamber, you name it. But dollar for dollar, Facebook by far was the way to launch a new community. We use Google as well. We would buy ads with Google for search terms, et cetera, buy programmatic ad display ads to boost the brand, but nothing came close to Facebook. And that is still my real fear, is that the barrier to entry for new publishers now to get markets, to build audience, it's huge. It's now a whole different animal. It's way more expensive. It takes way more time. And I think it's going to really hurt startup publishers and small publishers and those markets in that early phase of development.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear both of those perspectives, both the sort of the day-to-day operations, but even more how it impacts the ability to continue to grow and in new markets. Were you surprised at all by Facebook's, not just their response, because you are clear you planned for it, but their indication, and we've seen a number of reports that, not only was this not a bluff, but in fact, they could live without Canadian news without it having it have much of an impact. Because I still see some in the media, but particularly politicians saying, no, Facebook really would be better off with this news. And yet financially, at least so far, that at least on the financial side, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of sad, from our perspective, because obviously we want them to come back, but they certainly show no signs of being, willing to get back to the table. And, to be fair, I understand that. I mean, we have villainized them. We have said that they're evil. We've called them immoral. We have said they steal from us. We've said they do nothing in exchange back for us. I mean, why would you want to be friends with our industry when we've done that to them for the last few years? So, it's understandable, and obviously there's some third-party research out that kind of supports their statement that, look, we really haven't gone backwards since news has come off the platform. In fact, I've heard references to kind of a positive uptick in sentiment, meaning people are happier on Facebook without news. That might be reasonable. I do think that longer term it will hurt, and if it doesn't hurt Facebook, I think it hurts society. And that's my biggest concern, quite honestly, is that we live in a world now where people aren't nearly as engaged or informed about the world around them, whether that be their community, their province, their country, and the world overall. And so, only a small segment of our population is what I would consider an avid news reader, someone who will seek out news. And the beauty of Facebook was people could passively decide, okay, well, I'm interested. I want to know what's going on in my community. I'm not going to make the investment to subscribe to a newsletter. I'm not going to go to your site every day, but I'll follow you. And then, then all of a sudden they are informed. They, simple things like a missing person alert all of a sudden goes viral on Facebook and a person gets found because of it. That's gone now. Community events, charities that are happening, things that are happening at City Hall. Unless you're an avid news reader, you don't know about any of that stuff anymore, and you don't have the same kind of path to becoming an avid news reader anymore. And that's what scares me the most. I mean, it's sad, and I witnessed this with my own Facebook feed. Is just, now it's like, okay, there's stuff that entertains you, but I'm not connected to my community in the same kind of way. I'm not getting fact-based news that maybe I wouldn't have seeked out otherwise. I think that's the real loss, and I do think that in time that will start to deteriorate Facebook itself. I still suspect that if we're talking a year from now, they will have felt an impact, or someone else is going to come in and take their place in that sense. There will be a platform that takes advantage of the situation, and that might be something we're trying to build right now, by the way, which is a whole other story. But we'll take advantage of this opportunity that they have abandoned news, and so I think it will be a lose-lose in the end.
Okay. I mean, we'll come back to whether or not, if they start feeling it, maybe they will reverse in a few minutes once we talk about where as we look ahead. But one last piece before we get to the announced Google deal, and that would be what took place this fall with the draft regulations. Did you participate at all in that process? And what was your concern level, so to speak, about the prospect as Google panned some of the regulations that they would follow Meta's lead?
Yeah, so we have over the last few months been a lot more active. So a whole group of us got together. We made a fair bit of noise. We have been able to get the ear of the Minister of Heritage's office, in particular with the new minister. So she's been more accessible, I would suppose, or at least her staff have been, and they've been very responsive to us in that sense. And we collectively, as kind of this group of the local news collective members, some of the press forward members, were able to put forward our concerns. Um, you know, Obviously the big ones being, hey, like Meta isn't really important to this industry, and we'd really like you to get them back. And also, by the way, if you lose Google too, you are going to devastate the industry. And so our intent was really to stress the urgency of coming to a resolution with it, certainly Google and the attempts to get back to Meta. We had some other concerns as well, which we've again always had since the beginning, and that was, kind of the fair, proportionate response, kind of the formula in how that would be applied. So, I responded to the draft regulations and addressed some concerns about even the allowance for the 20% variance rules in the draft regulations, in the sense that actually meant some deals could be 40% variant. Because if you're saying, okay, well, your deal can only be 20% better or worse than the average, that means there's a 40% spread potentially there. And our view all along has been like, take this, whatever the money is, and divide it proportionally based on journalism expenditure. And we've always felt that was the clear way to do it. So we've certainly brought up those concerns. And now, of course, as we know is going to become the next fight, is how is this money divided between the traditional kind of news and digital publishing industry versus the private broadcasters like the Bells and Rogers of the world versus the CBC. And so we did also, make our concerns known in that sense throughout the fall. So I do feel that lately they're much more aware of us. They're much more receptive to hearing from us. So that's been a good improvement.
Yeah, that is good to hear, and I do want to definitely come to this issue of allocation of the money in a minute, because that does feel like one of the last domino to fall. But first, the deal itself. It sounds like you were heard, because the deal with Google, $100 million per year, indexed to inflation, as the minister often says, with basically what sounds like a fund. Google, rather than negotiating all these deals, cuts a check. Some of I assume their existing financial deals get rolled into that, and then you have this fight over the allocation side. What was your reaction to the deal, which, as I say, sounds quite a lot like what you were saying, made much more sense?
Yeah, I mean, so my first reaction was relief. Let's start with that. And as I'll say, whether it was $1 a year or 100 million a year or 200 million a year, the relief was because they weren't leaving the industry, which to me is way more valuable than whatever money we'll ultimately get from it. So I think that was the first reaction. I mean, the second was, there's almost a bit of sadness that I have, in the sense that, we are back to this idea of a fund. We're back to this idea that there's one kind of deal, presumably focused on journalism expenditure or the number of journalists you have. And it seems simple. It seems like this would be a great path. It's not about the link tax. It's not about them stealing content. It's Google's going to give the industry $100 million a year to support them, and it's going to be divided up fairly. That's a great solution. The sadness comes from the fact that it took us so long and so much stress and pain along the way to get here, where, I just wish you could go back in time and say, if we'd started that way, not only would it have not taken so long, but maybe Meta would still be in, because I think that's what they wanted too, right? I don't think either of those companies disagreed with the fact that they could and probably should support journalism. It was just the way that we went about it with the original bill. And now this outcome, in my opinion, it hardly relates to the act at all. Like it's not at all what the act says. The act was all about, large amounts of money with no cap. Now we have a cap. Now we have a fund, a pool. It was about private deals that all these individual groups could create under NDAs. That's gone now. So it's like, well, what's the act even for? I mean, the act is there for Google to avoid it now. So that's understandable. But it feels like there's so much fighting and stress that's gone into the act to get it where it was, and now it's just almost been, it's kind of irrelevant, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, no, podcasts obviously are not a visual medium, but I am vigorously shaking my head in agreement on this. It's always really looking forward to seeing the regulations to see how the government proposes to basically toss aside almost all the core elements that it said were in the legislation to begin with, and move in a direction that a lot of people had advocated for. And I'm often struck by those saying the sort of "I told you so's." You see, they ultimately would come back, and well, the Google came back based on really changing the legislation almost completely from what was passed. So the
Yeah.
legislation, it seems, did not work. I'm curious. It's, I guess, still perhaps it's too early, I suppose, to know what you're actually going to see out of this. But what's your hope, I guess, in terms of the impact it
Well,
might
and,
have on
yeah,
population?
and I mean, I guess to finish it off, I mean, I'm thrilled with the deal. I'm really happy that the government and Google got together and came to this amount, this point where Google didn't leave. So we're thankful for that. I look at what I would consider kind of a worst case scenario situation where the full scope of the CBC, the full scope of private broadcasters were included and captured in this. In which case, the estimates, depending on who you ask, are there's anywhere between 8 and 10,000 kind of journalists in Canada that would presumably qualify. And so if you take that the 100 million and you divide it up, you're looking at on average about $10,000 a journalist, which you know it's no secret. Village has about 90 journalists. That's 900,000 to 1.1 million kind of a year range ish in the scenario that kind of everyone is scoped in. And look, as you may know, when this all came about, we said, well, why should Google and Facebook have to pay us anything? Because they give us all this traffic for free and it drives 50% of our business. So if someone comes along and says, here's $1 million just because, we're thrilled. That's great. It's fantastic. That's our perspective, anyways. I suspect there's many concerns in the industry right now because those of us that had deals, I think some, my guess is based on that math, will be at risk of going backwards, which is going to be bad news, obviously for some larger companies. But it's still early to tell. Until those regulations come out, obviously we don't know. I do anticipate that there is some language that kind of scopes some of the broadcast rules out of this act, in which case the funding could be more per journalist, and maybe the industry will, be at least neutral from what those that had the deals before will be at least neutral, and some of us may be ahead. What I'm really thrilled for is that, as I've always said, I mean, we started as the small guy, right? And we've had to fight for our place in this world for years and years. I'm just happy that many other publishers will have deals with Google now because, and I've said this previously, but as much as it goes against us, it's always been unfair. Like we had to deal with Google and Facebook. We got a bunch of money that some of our counterparts did not get. It gave us a massive competitive advantage over the last couple of years. It's not fair. So I'm really happy that a lot of these independent publishers, smaller publishers, and startup publishers probably will see some money out of this based on the way it looks like it's coming out, and I'm really thankful for that.
Yeah, that is certainly a positive for them. I want to unpack just a couple of things that you just said. First off, for those that do have deals, and you mentioned that you do, that idea of getting whatever it happens to be, let's say $1 million to keep it round, isn't entirely a million in new money then, because I'm presuming that the running assumption is if you were getting existing money, that's lost from those other deals, and so but you're now getting this new pot of money. And you mentioned for some that might be a net negative. So I'm assuming you're suggesting that there may be some who had large enough deals that once they figure out what their allocation is, it'll actually be less than what they were getting before.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I think the trick for Village is when we first signed those deals, we were probably half the size we are today, but they were static deals. They weren't variable based on the number of journalists you had. And so since then, we've got twice the number of journalists. So any formula that considers that, and doing the rough math of it likely means we'll be ahead. But you know. For publishers that had deals with Google and Facebook, some of the larger publishers who, in some cases, have laid off journalists over the years, now your meta deal is done as of December. And so Google kind of almost has to make up for both of them in this new scenario of distribution based. I suspect there'll be many of those larger deals that will go backwards or quite possibly could.
Yeah, I mean I suppose that then helps explain some of the reaction or non-reaction we've seen just in the first, several days, where you're happy. CBC has sort of has been happy, which I think raises a whole other very large issue, because they stand to perhaps take one of the largest shares of what's out there unless the government steps in. But there hasn't been a lot publicly supportive language coming from some of the publishers. In fact, Torstar has now openly opposed it. And it does sound like part of the battle is over whether or not the government gets directly involved in deciding, both who is a journalist, if that's the metric, and how broad does that go to include some of the broadcaster personnel that wouldn't otherwise be included, and to what extent are broadcasters included more broadly.
Yeah, and I think that is the trick now, right? And this will be the next battle, right? Is who's running this new collective agreement, and how do you bring kind of the News Media Canada, the broadcasters together who have very different views of the outcome of that? And I think there's a lot to be learned from the final regulations. Now, from the hints that we kind of see along the way, I do suspect that the CBC won't fully be in scope, and probably not the large private broadcasters, just from kind of little things the minister has said along the way, et cetera. There's certainly it's pointing in that direction, and in which case it's possible that the historic deals that are there might be okay. But it's going to become a math exercise at that point, and I really do anticipate a lot of fights between various groups that are interested in this.
Yeah, I know that it's going to be it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out in just a few weeks' time, and as the government tries to work out those final regs. It is, I guess, for me, just personally striking that when I appeared before committee, I talked about the problems of including broadcasters this way, definitely the problems of including the CBC this way. There was too much silence from too many other players who I guess weren't anticipating what the implications might be, regardless of what the numbers might look like.
Yeah.
Why don't we close with this? So that's part of what you see going forward. What else do you see sort of in the coming months ahead? What's the prospect of Meta returning? How challenging do you think all of this is going to be to get up and running and operation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm fascinated to kind of hear what the timing looks like. Again, we've got some hints of that, but I would suspect it's going to take many months to get this collective figured out and to get everyone into agreement and to get funds flowing. I would say 6 months to a year potentially. I don't know what will happen with the Google content licensing deals in the meantime. They might decide to suspend them until they figure it out. That would be, I suppose, reasonable. With Meta, I have a good relationship with some of the staff, and certainly check in with them where I can, and they're always very responsive, kind of forthcoming. I don't, I have a very slim sliver of hope that when the final regulations come out officially, maybe they'll say, okay, we'll come back, but I highly doubt they will. I think that they would need to, see some visible pain from it otherwise to get them to reconsider. I don't think, again, we've kind of treated them so badly for so long. I think they've left the game, and they're happy to be out of it at the moment.
All right. Well, I mean, if that is indeed the case, and that's certainly what the company has been saying, it's hard to see how all of this is a win, because it's clear that the legislation's caused a bit of harm, but at the same time, you and many others have been trying to find a way to make the best out of a difficult set of circumstances.
Well, and that's the thing, right? I mean, if you look at the fact that Meta's out from a money standpoint, and Meta's out from a traffic standpoint, and Google thankfully is in, but at a reduced money standpoint, you might almost argue that we were better off without the bill at all. That if you could, and to be fair, as Village, if you said to me, look, Jeff, like if you could go back in time and there was no bill, but you could have your Meta traffic back, but you don't get any license payments from Google or Meta, I'd say great. The value of that traffic is worth more than the money that we anticipate getting out of this. And I guess that's the sad part if Meta remains out, is that even though Google thankfully is in, we might have been better off without the bill at all.
Wow. It's a somewhat discouraging way, actually, very discouraging way to end it. But I think it's a pretty realistic take in terms of where things are at. Jeff, thanks for coming on once again. I think you're the first 3-time guest on the podcast. And I think I've chosen well because it's because you've been right in the center of this issue that has preoccupied so many people for so long. So thanks again for taking the time to join me.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
That's the Law Bytes podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbytes@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBytesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bytes podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening.